All right, ready to dive deep into these large language models? LLMs, is that what we're calling them?
Yep, LLMs, you got all those notes ready to sift through it all.
I think so, but it's a lot to unpack. This stuff is dense.
It is. Let's see if we can make some sense of it for everyone listening.
One thing that struck me, like, it's almost eerie how training one of these LLMs, it's like raising a kid.
Oh, how so?
Well, there are these stages, right? You've got the pre-training and then the fine-tuning and then you've got the reinforcement learning. It's like
Yeah.
you start by just like cramming their heads full of basic info and then you start showing them examples of how to do things right. Then eventually you kind of let them loose to practice and figure things out on their own.
That's a fascinating analogy. It
Yeah.
really does mirror the process in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it highlights just how complex these systems are.
Yeah.
Should we start with that first phase, that pre-training?
Okay, yeah, pre-training. So that's where the LLM basically becomes like a digital bookworm, right? Just absorbing all this information.
Yeah, exactly. It's like feeding the AI the entire internet. I mean, that's basically what we're doing. These LLMs are trained on massive data sets of text and code, like trillions of words.
Trillions.
Trillions. There's some huge data sets out there. Google has one called C4, and then there's the pile from Luther AI.
Yeah.
They're massive, and they capture the vast diversity of human language.
It's hard to even wrap my head around that amount of data. But how does an AI even start to process that? It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Right. Well, before the LLM can really learn from all that text, it needs to be broken down into these smaller units. We call them tokens.
Token.
Yeah. And these tokens, they can be words or even parts of words, sometimes even punctuation marks.
It's not just words.
Right. It's this whole complex process. And the actual scheme, the scheme that we use, it can really impact how well the LLM performs.
Hmm.
Like GPT-4, you've heard of that one, right?
Uh-huh.
It uses over 100,000 unique tokens.
Okay, so it's breaking down all this language into these tokens, but what's the point of that? What's the advantage?
Well, that tokenization process, it helps the LLM learn the underlying structure of language, how words relate to each other, how grammar works, even these like subtle nuances of style and tone.
Mm-hmm.
It's like learning the rules of the game before you start actually playing.
Right, building a foundation. Okay, so it's absorbed all this raw data, this massive amount of information, but how do we actually teach it to do something useful with all of that?
Right, that's where the fine-tuning comes in.
Right.
This is where we start shaping the LLM's abilities. We start showing it how to actually apply all that raw knowledge.
So this is more like hands-on training.
Exactly. So we're feeding it these carefully crafted examples of conversations. We're showing it, here's the ideal assistant response to this prompt, this kind of question.
So like giving it a crash course in human interaction.
Exactly. It's learning how humans use language,
Yeah.
to communicate, to solve problems, to even express creativity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so the LLM is starting to become a little more conversational, but I imagine there's still a lot of room for improvement at this point.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, that's where that final phase of training comes in. You remember we talked about reinforcement learning?
Yeah.
That's where the LLM actually gets to practice on its own. It tries different approaches, learns from its mistakes.
So it's not just mimicking us anymore. It's actually starting to like develop its own strategies.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this. These strategies, they can get really complex and nuanced. In some cases, LLMs have even been observed to develop these things called thought chains. It's like an internal monologue, almost like it's thinking out loud as it works through a problem.
That's wild. So it's not just giving an answer. It's like showing its work step by step.
Exactly. And it's not like we program them to do that.
Yeah.
These thought chains, they emerge spontaneously. It's like they're developing their own internal language for understanding and solving problems.
That's a little creepy, honestly. Like it's developing its own way of thinking. Makes you wonder what else it might be thinking about that we don't even know about.
Well, that's a whole other conversation probably. But yeah, it's definitely mind-blowing stuff.
Okay, so we've got this AI that's trained on all this data. It's developing its own thought processes. But even with all this training, they still make mistakes, right? I mean, I keep hearing about these hallucinations where the LLM just makes stuff up.
Yeah, hallucinations, it's a real concern. And it kind of highlights this fundamental tension in how LLMs learn.
What do you mean?
Well, they're trained to predict the most statistically likely next token in a sequence. So sometimes that leads them to generate outputs that are like plausible, but not actually true.
So it's not intentionally lying, it's just trying to make sense of the world based on the patterns it's learned?
Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
it's so focused on following the rules of language
Hmm.
that it kind of loses track of the underlying truth.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense. But it seems like there's kind of a disconnect there. Like the LLM has all this information stored away from the pre-training phase, but it can still trip up when it's trying to actually access and apply that knowledge. So how does an LLM's memory really work?
That's a great question. It's helpful to think about it in terms of like knowledge versus working memory.
Hmm.
The knowledge that the LLM gets during pre-training, that's stored in its parameters. It's like its long-term memory.
Okay.
But when you're actually interacting with the LLM, it's got this limited working memory,
Hmm.
similar to how our own minds can only hold a certain amount of information at once.
So it's like it has this massive library, but it can only pull a few books off the shelf at any given time. No wonder it makes mistakes sometimes. It's trying to juggle too much information.
Exactly. And that highlights how important context is. If you want the LLM to work with some specific information, it's better to give it that information directly rather than expecting it to sift through its entire knowledge base.
It's like giving it a cheat sheet. Rather than expecting it to remember everything from that giant textbook it read months ago, this is all starting to make a lot more sense. But I'm realizing we've only just scratched the surface here.
Oh yeah, just getting started. It
Yeah.
is, it really is. All this talk about memory and context, it makes me think about another really fascinating thing about LLMs. It's their ability to actually develop their own unique ways of solving problems. Remember we were talking about those cognitive strategies earlier.
Oh, yeah. The idea that they can figure out their own ways to tackle a problem. I mean, that's pretty mind blowing when you think about it. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, one example, a really striking one actually, is this model called DeepSeek R1. During the reinforcement learning phase, the researchers noticed it started doing this really interesting thing. It was producing these detailed internal monologues. It's almost like it was thinking out loud, as it was working through a problem.
So it wasn't just spitting out an answer, it was actually showing its work step by step.
Exactly. And they call these thought chains, and they provide this like really fascinating glimpse into the LLM's reasoning process.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable is these chains, they weren't programmed in. It's not like we told the model to do this. They emerged spontaneously.
That's incredible. It's like it's developing its own, like, internal language for understanding and solving these problems.
Yeah.
But it also raises some interesting questions, like if these systems are developing their own cognitive strategies, how can we be sure that those strategies, like, align with human values and goals?
That's a huge question. It's a crucial question, and it's one that researchers are really actively exploring right now. As these LLMs become more and more sophisticated, it's essential that we develop safeguards and these kind of ethical frameworks to guide their development and deployment.
So it's almost like we're not just teaching these AIs how to think, but we're
Yeah.
also trying to instill some kind of like sense of responsibility, like, hey, think about the consequences of your actions.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, we want to make sure that these LLMs are not just intelligent, but they're also aligned with human values and ethics.
All right, so we've talked about how they're trained, how they learn, some of the potential pitfalls. But let's shift gears a little bit. How are these LLMs actually being used in the real world right now?
Well, you're probably interacting with them more often than you realize. They're powering a huge range of applications, everything from chatbots to virtual assistants to search engines and content creation tools.
So they're already pretty ubiquitous, it seems like, and it seems like they're poised to have a pretty significant impact on, I mean, a variety of industries. Are there any areas in particular that you find particularly exciting or promising?
One area that I think holds a ton of potential is using LLMs as like creative partners.
Hmm.
Imagine being able to collaborate with an LLM to, brainstorm ideas, write stories, compose music, maybe even design new products.
That sounds incredible, but can they really be creative, or are they just kind of like remixing existing content?
That's a great question. And it's kind of a debate right now.
Yep.
Some people argue that they're just like regurgitating patterns from the data, while others think that there might be a spark of genuine creativity there. It's a question that I think, philosophers and artists are going to be grappling with for a while as these LLMs keep evolving.
So the jury's still out on true AI creativity, but it's clear that they can generate outputs that are novel, surprising, even beautiful sometimes. But beyond these kind of specific applications, it seems like LLMs have the potential to really transform society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. They have the potential to revolutionize so many fields like education, healthcare, scientific research, even government.
Okay, give me some examples. How could LLMs be used in those fields specifically?
Well, imagine having personalized learning experiences that are tailored to each student's needs. Or, AI-powered diagnostic tools that can detect diseases much earlier.
Hmm.
Or LLMs that can actually help us solve complex global challenges like climate change or poverty. I mean, the possibilities are enormous.
Those are some pretty big possibilities, but I can also see how some people might be concerned about, the potential downsides, right? Like,
Yeah.
what about job displacement or economic inequality? These are things that people are worried about.
Right, and those are valid concerns, and we have to address them. We have to address them proactively. I think the key is to focus on developing LLMs that augment human capabilities, not replace them entirely.
So it's more about collaboration than competition.
Exactly. LLMs excel at things like analyzing data, automating repetitive processes, and generating creative content. But that frees up humans to focus on things that require, critical thinking, empathy, complex decision-making.
Hmm.
It's really about harnessing the strengths of both humans and AI to create a more productive and equitable future.
That's a really encouraging perspective. So it sounds like, yeah, these LLMs have the potential to be incredibly beneficial, but it's really up to us to kind of guide their development and make sure that they're used responsibly.
I couldn't agree more. The future of LLMs is ultimately in our hands.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the intricacies of LLM training to the philosophical questions surrounding AI creativity.
I know, right? It's crazy how much there is to talk about. And we've really only scratched the surface. This field is moving so fast. There are new breakthroughs, new applications emerging all the time.
And speaking of breakthroughs, there's one more fascinating aspect of LLMs that I want to explore. It's this concept of
The
agents.
agents, yeah.
Not like secret agents, sneaking
Mm.
around in trench coats, although that would be kind of cool.
Right.
We're talking about AI agents that are powered by these LLMs.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. So imagine an LLM that's not just passively responding to prompts, but it's actively taking steps to achieve goals in the real world.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but I'm having a little trouble picturing what that would actually look like. Can you give me like a concrete example?
Sure. Let's say your goal is to, I don't know, increase traffic to your website. So instead of asking an LLM to just write a blog post, you could task an AI agent with that goal directly.
Mm-hmm.
And then the agent could break down that complex goal into all these smaller tasks like researching keywords, drafting content, optimizing for SEO, maybe even scheduling social media posts. And it could do all of that autonomously.
Wow. Okay, that's a whole different level of capability. But could an AI agent really handle all of that complexity on its own? That seems like a huge leap.
It is. It's definitely a challenging area of research, but we're already seeing some really promising progress. Like one key area is developing LLMs that can reason about cause and effect, plan and execute these multi-step actions, and even learn from their mistakes as they go.
So it's not just about following instructions. It's almost like, are we giving the LLM a sense of agency? Like it has its own goals and motivations. It's a little unsettling to think about, honestly.
I understand that. Yeah, it does raise some pretty profound questions about control and responsibility. I mean, as we develop these increasingly autonomous AI agents, we have to think about the ethical implications. We have to make sure that their actions align with human values.
It's almost like we're not just building tools anymore. We're creating these entities with a certain degree of autonomy. And with that autonomy comes, well, a responsibility to really think carefully about the potential consequences. But I mean, if we get it right, the potential benefits are immense, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
AI agents could revolutionize so many industries. Imagine AI agents managing complex supply chains, personalizing healthcare treatments, or even assisting with disaster relief efforts. I mean, the possibilities are really extraordinary.
Yeah, it's almost like we're on the cusp of this new era of collaboration between humans and AI. But let's zoom out for a second and think about the bigger picture. What does the future hold for the LLMs themselves? Are there any like fundamental advancements on the horizon in terms of how these models are actually built and trained?
One area that I find really fascinating is this idea of continuous learning. So imagine an LLM that's constantly adapting and improving based on new data and experiences, instead of having this fixed knowledge base from its initial training.
So it's not just a static snapshot of its training data, it's constantly evolving and getting smarter.
Exactly. And I think continuous learning could lead to LLMs that are far more adaptable, robust, and capable than anything we've seen so far. It could really blur the lines between how humans and AI systems learn. It might push us closer to a future where AI can truly learn and grow alongside us.
That's an incredibly exciting, and thought-provoking idea. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of LLMs, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that LLMs are incredibly powerful tools. They have the potential to reshape our world in profound ways. But with that power comes a responsibility to make sure that they're developed ethically and that they're used for the benefit of all humanity.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of LLMs, well, enlightening and maybe even a little bit mind-blowing.
It is a fascinating field, and it's evolving so rapidly, so keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those questions. Who knows what incredible advancements are waiting for us just around the corner?